in Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about how writing works, how writers work, and how the best writers risk being strange. And I'm talking to Wren Brian today about a topic that I frankly don't know that much about. In fact, I'm sort of considered the authority against this topic in some ways or some circles, because I'm best known for a book called Clockfire, which was a series of 77 plays that would be impossible to produce. And so I'm sort of, in many ways, well known as a person against the theater, or writing against the theater. I'm not personally against the theater, but the book is sort of, a challenge to the theater. And so I wanted to bring on Wren to talk about the theater and writing for the theater, maybe in a slightly more normative way, because it is an area where I get a lot of questions and I don't necessarily have a lot of experience. And even, am sometimes thought of as an adversarial figure, although I don't really think I am. I mean, it's just a cool idea for a book in many respects. But Wren, could you talk a little bit about sort of your background in the theater and sort of how you got into writing for the theater and your interest in writing for the theater? Why the theater, I suppose, is my sort of core question to you.
It's a good question. Because I kind of wish I wanted to write for something else or do something else with my life other than this. But hey, it caught me at a fairly young age. Like as a kid, and I think it was just because there's a lot of community theater around. I grew up in Whitehorse, Yukon, which is a small city. It's a city, but it's small. So we didn't really get a lot of professional theater up there until I was my later years, actually. But went to see community theater, and I saw like Friends in it and stuff, and it just seemed really cool. And so I've kind of always loved the theater and been attracted to it. And there was like a great high school program called the Music, Art, and Drama program that from grade 9 to 12 you could be in, and you created theater and you did like haunted houses and winter shows for the kids and stuff. And it's actually very fringy. So it was a great learning ground to learn how to do that. And in that context, I explored acting, I explored design, and I did explore writing as well. And had always been interested in telling stories, I think. And definitely explored it and caught the theater bug. And so I went to school for it. I went to university for theater and film, because I didn't know at the time, because I was drawn to both. They're both very similar in a lot of ways, but they are and they aren't. And I think actually the pandemic has shown us just how strong that difference is. And I hope people are reflecting, I think, on, yeah, they're similar, but there's also very strong differences. But at university, actually, I never took a playwriting course. I did everything else because, correctly, in some ways, I figured writing was something I could learn how to do on my own. And I wanted to learn or try to see, am I an actor? Am I a director? Am I a designer? Am I a filmmaker? Am I an editor? So I took all those courses in that to sort of eliminate. So I graduated in 2013. By the end of 2015, I had eliminated everything else and was like, nah, I'm a writer. The story I like telling, because it is just funny in retrospect, is when the last thing I was exploring before landing on writing was directing for theater, because I'd kind of eliminated film as an interest. And it felt like more work to go find a suitable royalty-free play to get my hands on to direct than to just write my own play, which is hysterical in retrospect.
There's a couple interesting things in what you just sort of said and laid out in your path there that I kind of recognized from my experience, because a lot of people don't realize that I actually originally went to school. When I went into my first year of university, my idea was that I was going to, get into, theater and acting. And I actually, took a theater class. I took a bunch of business classes, a bunch of theater classes, and I quickly dropped out of both. I wish in retrospect that I had stayed in the business classes, but the theater classes I got out of for just a really particular reason, which is that I just realized I don't have the body awareness to be a good actor. Like, I just don't know what my face looks like when you know what I mean? Like, and I know you can develop that stuff, but I just could see the long, hard slog of it a little bit. I decided just kind of to focus more on the writing side of it. But I also started, although I still, really love the theater in a lot of ways, especially more kind of the fringier side of the theater, as you say. There were two things I really was starting to get frustrated with when I looked at theater and when I went to the theater. And these are the sort of the things that laid the groundwork for my kind of Clockfire book, which was I started to get very frustrated that I felt the theater. It seems a weird complaint, but I was always very annoyed that they never acknowledged that the audience was there. Or if they acknowledged the audience is there, it was often kind of a facile engagement. So, but I would see these really great plays. I remember seeing one, it was actually a zombie attack play at the Fringe. I forget the name of it. But it was a really excellent play where it had a bit of a more serious meta engagement. And so those meta engagements I found were very like touch and go. Like, I'd see some theater where they just were impressive and blew me away, and other theater where it just was like a bad joke. And once the audience responded to them, it didn't work anymore. But the other thing that I just felt like was kind of, frustrating to me about the theater was just the same thing that I think is just an integral part of the theater, which is that you have to deal with the logistics of the theater all the time. And I foolishly, now in retrospect, I said it was like, I could do the opposite tack of years. I was like, I'm going to move into film and screenwriting, as if there were less logistics there. There's, in fact, more logistics, and you need more money, and so on and so forth. But I just didn't really see it at the time. And of course, but you touch on a thing that I think is really interesting and that I'd like to get into a bit more, which is that, writing for film and writing for the theater, it has certain overlaps in the Venn diagram, but there are some very, very serious differences. But I'd like to kind of get a little bit more into like some of the specifics of that, especially. So one thing I just kind of wonder is when you're writing for the theater, it may seem like an odd question, but do you move your body around like as you're writing a theater script? Like, I find with screenwriting, I'm always kind of trying to stand and deliver the lines or like move into a position. Like, I have to describe how body movements work. And so I struggle with two things in screenwriting, and I kind of am curious how you approach these things in writing, theatrically. One, I wonder always, like, how much description or instruction should I give actors? And two, I just wonder, like, okay, does a body and space move this way? Which is something you have to more seriously consider in the theater, because in screenwriting, you can cheat it. But in the theater, they're there. So I'm kind of curious how you account for, I guess, like the body itself in a physical space in sort of writing. Like, are there things you've learned or that you try to do, or that you even just find frustrating or difficult when you're trying to kind of put together a script?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And I guess first I need to say every playwright is different. So how I work is not going to be how others work. Because I know that some who do walk around and talk to themselves and are quite physical, I don't tend to be. And this is partially because actually I think one of the key differences between film and theater is I think theater by and large has been moving away from doing very specific stage directions. So I never actually, or try not to say the actor picks up a mug and drinks from it, unless it's like very important to the scene, or like sometimes I'll throw in a like they drink or something, but I try to be very not specific with it and very sparing with it to allow the actors to do it. And there's multiple reasons for this. And part of it is because I personally believe as a playwright that I want to leave space for the other artists to make their own choices and acknowledge that, I can think of stuff sitting alone in my apartment, but when they're in this space actually enacting it, they're going to have their own ideas that are probably going to be way better than anything that I can come up with. but you can't really do that in film. And I think his film is much more, it's weird to say, but I feel like the writing of it is a much more visual medium, and the whole thing is a bit more visual than theater, because theater, it is visual, but you do have, like you say, those constraints of, you have a space and you have a stage and you can do anything on that stage in front of the audience, but you don't have the time in film, right, where you can completely change locations. You can, and you can get those super close-ups, and like theater can sometimes try to do that. I've seen plays try to do that with projections, and they have a camera on stage and they're filming close-ups of the actors that then get projected on the screen, but you still are dealing with that whole image, and the audience is removed from that visualization. So that's why, as a playwright, I really try not to get caught up in those details. And so in that way, I don't move around a lot. What I do is I read aloud in my apartment all the time. And like, as I'm writing, and this is why I'm not a playwright who does writes in cafes. I know plenty of playwrights who do or like to write in public, but I don't, because I'm going to end up talking to myself, and I don't want other people to have to hear that. Especially because, yeah, it ends up being like where I try to play both characters, and so I'm trying to move really fast between the lines, which only goes so far, but I think it helps in that revising stage and that drafting stage, as I'm trying to figure out the rhythms and things like that.
There's an interesting kind of comparison with screenwriting there, where I think one of the things that is the same about both of the mediums, like a script for a film or a script for the theater, is that in both examples, as a writer, you're really constructing a blueprint document. And as you say, you have to kind of really be mindful of, where am I going to leave space, or make sure I leave enough space, like for these other artists to come and have room to fill the space, like with their interpretation and make their choices. At the same time, of course, there's certain things you need to be in control of, or work you have to do as a writer that, it isn't in many ways fair to make the actors do, but you got to have a level of control, but not be too controlling. And especially, it's a tougher balancing act to begin with, but I think it's especially hard in the early stages of a project, where maybe you don't know who that actor is going to be. You don't know what actress is going to be saying these lines. So you got to kind of write for a person, but also trust this person that doesn't exist yet to do a lot of things when you don't necessarily have that trust relationship, because you don't know who they are. At the same time, though, even though they're both blueprint documents, I think the difference is in the theater, unlike the screenplay, like the theater script, unlike the screenplay, the theater script is a literary document, and a screenplay is not. This is something I really kind of point out when I'm teaching screenwriting, is like, as a screenwriter, you are not writing literature. There's an artistry to it, and you're just literally not producing a document that has literary qualities and is meant as a fixed literary document. Whereas a theater script might be published, as you say, and it might be sold again and again as that published document, and it would be envisioned and brought to life and altered and changed in every production, perhaps, or even every night of the same production. But it really does live as a piece of literature, in a manner of speaking, that screenplays don't. So like the description, for example, that you find in a theater script, although it does not necessarily need to be quote unquote well written, there is like a way in which at some point it's meant ideally to serve like double duty as something you could read. Whereas for screenplays, it's just about clarity and function. And if it's really well written piece of description, it's almost an impediment in a screenplay. Like once there's a poetic quality to your description or your action or anything that's not dialogue, it actually is now not functioning in a screenplay properly because you could interpret it more than one way, and that's not what it's for. Whereas in the theater, it seems to me, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but the theater seems to me like things like action and dialogue, all those sort of not action and description, all the non-dialogue text is meant to have at least some level of poetic quality and be a bit more open to interpretation than, say, a screenplay's description would have to be.
Yeah, I think we've definitely moved into that direction. I do think historically it's gone through some changes, because a lot of the published plays that we actually see from, you know, the earliest 20th century, Tennessee Williams is the favorite example, is that those stage directions are actually the production notes and like the stage manager writing at the blocking. So it's not necessarily that Tennessee Williams was like Laura walks across the stage, because like if you read Tennessee Williams, it's so like this is what the actors do all the time, and like here's a very long description of what the stage looks like. And I do believe some of that was Tennessee Williams, but some of it wasn't. And so I found it interesting when I was taking theater classes and acting classes in particular, is that often we got the advice to cross out any stage directions anytime you get a scene, to not even read them, to just cross them out. Which now I'm like, don't do that. Because I think contemporary playwrights, we still need to write stage directions. Like we can't hand you a script that's just entirely dialogue. And so we are working to make those stage directions meaningful and helpful and yeah, literary, and adding to the experience of reading the script. And I did get this because I was kind of stuck, I think, initially doing, I'm only going to write stage directions if I need to tell the actors to move, and that's it. Otherwise, I'm not doing it. But then I heard Kevin Loring, he's a Canadian playwright, speaking at a panel, and he talked about, have fun with your stage descriptions, be poetic, do whatever you need to do to describe the feeling that you're going for. And so now that's really what I try to work on in stage directions, is the feeling. And so it's like you can interpret that however you want, the actors, the directors, the designers. And I have found that freeing and hopefully more helpful, because I did find part of the issue with, I think, in the theater industry today is we've fallen into this pattern of 3 to 4 week rehearsal periods, which is really short. I believe in Europe they do longer, they do 5 weeks, 6 weeks. I think I was reading a book on directing, and in America in the 20th century, and they had like 8 weeks sometimes. So now we're trying to do it in 3 weeks, and that is not enough time for actors to memorize, learn their blocking, and figure out what you're trying to say in the script, and get all of the subtlety that you as a playwright know, because you've been living with these characters for years, usually by the point that it sees life. And so I was finding that it's like, yeah, you don't know why I described how this character moves, because you haven't had time to really delve into that. And so now I think, okay, I want to help the actors, the directors, the designers figure out what the internal world of this is as quickly as possible. And so I use stage directions for that.
I feel like screenwriting has kind of moved in that direction a little bit as well, where there was a trend in screenwriting for a little while. I don't know, I don't read a lot of screenplays these days, so I'm not sure how the trend sits right now, but there was a trend for quite a while there that people were really getting flowery in the scripts because of Quentin Tarantino, and people were reading Quentin Tarantino's scripts, and they were noticing like how literary and novelesque they were in terms of the direction and that he would put into the script and so on. They'd have these, all the stuff in the script that traditionally you don't write things in a script that can't be filmed, right? But of course, he would fill a script with all this, stage direction, description, and so on that you just couldn't film, and it was just meant to kind of assist the reader. What people forgot, I think people just started copying this. So what people forgot, of course, was that Quentin Tarantino was directing his own scripts. And so Quentin Tarantino knows what Quentin Tarantino means, and doesn't require proper, sensible direction. And what Quentin Tarantino cares about is this person reading the script who is like Quentin Tarantino is writing for one or for two audiences, himself and someone who's going to give him millions of dollars. And he just doesn't want that guy to put the script down. And so it's a very different way of writing that isn't necessarily a blueprint and isn't necessarily something that like people should be copying. Like there's a level at which, if you don't have millions of dollars, you got to think about that person who does and what do they want to, what's going to be fun for them in a script. But you also need to kind of think a bit further down the line of like, who's going to use this script? And will I drive them insane because I've given them impossible directions and now they got to like spend 5 years figuring out what I said on page 53 and whether they need to even make that up. Like people forget sometimes that somebody has to make that thing. Like in theater also, like perhaps if you describe a poster on the wall in the background, like somebody's going to go make that poster, and maybe you were just doing it for tone and you don't actually even care what the poster is. In which case you need to kind of be mindful of the other people being involved in the production side of this thing. So I feel like what I think is interesting about theater writing is it has a lot of those similarities, but as you say, like it's sort of using, one real difference I think is that it uses time differently. Like in the theater, you really just have a time unfolding in a certain respect, like that I think it isn't necessarily the same. The film, like the simple illustration is typically in film, you don't see people walk across rooms. You just cut. And when you do see somebody walk from one side of the room to the other, it's actually usually a very, it's very unusual. Like in There Will Be Blood, there's a really long shot where the character this thing bursts into flames and this character is running from one part of the field to the other to get to it. And he just shows you the whole run. He makes you, it's one single shot. He makes you follow that character just so that you feel with the character how long it's taking to get there. But that's completely bizarre in film. Whereas in the theater, you really do have a body in space, and that's some of the specialness of the experience, that we're sort of always there experiencing how they're going through it, even if you're jumping from like time to time in the story. So I'm curious to know if you have any thoughts about that a little bit, like how time works maybe in the theater, or how to play with time, or even just making the audience wait for things. I think is something that is very different. And I would suspect the theater audience has a bit more tolerance for waiting, if that makes sense. Waiting for information, letting somebody sit and be silent. Something it seems like you can do in the theater that the audience just doesn't have the toleration in film in the same way.
I'm thinking, and I'm not sure, like maybe I should start thinking about it more, but as a playwright, I'm not sure that I think about it that much. I think it's because those are things to feel out in the room and in the space. And that's something that the actors and the directors will feel out.
One way it kind of does make into a script often though is, beat, the word beat, right? And so I'm always really interested in how people use the word beat or don't use it, if that makes sense, in both screenplays and theater. So I mean, it sounds like a weird topic, but I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the word beat and maybe just explain to people who don't know what that is and what it means in theater and screenwriting. And then maybe if you could talk a little bit about whether you use it, how you use it, and so on, because I think it's a really interesting, unique part of this writing for the film and theater that people don't necessarily know or think about if they haven't done that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm at a juncture, I guess, in my writing where I'm exploring actually not using beat. I used to use it all the time. But yeah, a beat, people have like slightly different descriptions of it. But usually it's just a moment, and it's just a moment of silence, but it's not a pause. It's not lengthy. but usually it's just that moment of silence, I guess. But there is usually a bit of attention to it too, I feel, is what it's sort of indicating. And usually it's put after the character with the previous line has said something to take another character back, or that's made them have to shift something. And so it's often, I think, indicating a shift. Um, and like this is where you can get, and I think I was overusing beats sometimes, because I know in a play analysis, you can also talk about a beat as a section of script. And it's while the characters are talking about the same thing, and then beat, and then they switch topics or they move on to something else. So I think the funny thing about that word is that I think everyone has a slightly different idea of what that is. And it depends who you're talking to, it depends on what context you're talking about it. But in playwriting, I used to use it as the other character has said something that's made the other character need to take a moment, or has made them have to switch tactics or something like that. But I'm currently off of using it, just again to try to go, you know what, the actors are going to feel this out. And maybe there doesn't need to be silence there, because I think it puts pressure for there to be a bit of silence. And it's like, maybe that's not the best thing. I don't know. I don't know how they're going to want to. And I don't want to limit, I think, the ideas. And I think this is also part of me trying to make sure, as much as I can, that actors and directors take my stage direction seriously. Because I think if you overuse something, they're going to go, whatever, it's just use this beat all the time. We don't have to do the beats all the time. And so I want to, if I do use it, because I think I'm exploring it, it's like, okay, maybe I use it once or twice in a script, that it's really important, that it's like, I really am pretty sure there's no way you could do this fast. If you do it fast, you're going to miss something. So that hopefully they'll go, oh, never uses beats. Used it here, we're going to pay attention to that, and we're going to explore what she's trying to say in doing that. I don't know if this is going to work or not, but that's currently what I'm exploring in my writing to get away from using it, overusing it.
Yeah, just to kind of follow up on something you said there, there's a way that it's one of those words that I find kind of annoying, in the sense that people use it in two ways, like you say. So like one way that we use the word beat always is if we're talking about narrative structure, just for people listening, a beat is an action reaction pattern. So, if we start talking about something, that's it. Now we're in a beat. When we switch topics, or the conversation changes direction in some structural way, now we're in a new beat. So you can just break down a scene beat by beat in that like sense of its narrative structure. But also people will write the word beat, like Wren's saying, like, and so it might look something like this. Sarah says, how's Johnny? And Tom says, and then it goes beat. And then Johnny says, he's fine. Of course, the beat now indicates to everyone reading the script, and hopefully to the audience, right, that like that split second of like hesitation means he's lying, and just trying to not have her notice. And then you get into the question, like, does she notice, and so on and so forth. So like people will just write the word beat into a script often in that way. Whether they should or not, I guess, is the other question that you're kind of getting into here. Like, is it better to kind of do that or not do it, and so on and so forth. But that is sort of the way that word will function typically in scripts, although it is unfortunately also used to describe this narrative structure. I don't know how that word got applied into narrative structure as well, but it has. Something that kind of this starts to move towards a little bit, and where you might write a bunch of beats potentially in a script, is when writing monologues. I think one other real simple difference between film and theater, I think, is how they handle dialogue. So in film, of course, dialogue is very, very short relative to the theater usually. And certainly there's a tolerance in the theater for speeches that you don't have in film. You maybe get one speech in a film. Whereas in the theater, I think just generally speaking, you have more play there as an author, and the audience has a bit more expectation that there's going to be moments in this story when people are just going to talk more, or maybe give longer speeches, or even just give soliloquies, talking to themselves or talking to the audience in that way. Or perhaps, we have, even on the extreme end, a play that just is a soliloquy, like a monologue, which we don't really see in film so much. I mean, you might find an example here or there, but it isn't its own real, in a theater, that's a real class of play. So I'm curious to know just your sort of thoughts on writing dialogue, or even if you have tips on writing dialogue for people, and then just sort of extending that out. What do you think is different or interesting or special about monologues and soliloquies in the theater?
I think, interestingly enough, in contemporary theater, I think we're moving away from monologues and soliloquies. Shakespeare gets to do soliloquies, but the rest of us aren't allowed. I've got some issues with Shakespeare veneration in theater, but yeah, because I feel that you do these days get questioned about monologues and soliloquies if you put them in a play that's not a one-person play. One-person plays are the exception, and they're still it's a big area that I think is going to just get bigger because of the pandemic, because it's now really attractive to, like, great, we can have one person on stage and they're completely socially distanced. Let's do it. And which is really cool, because it is, I think you're right, a very unique aspect of theater that you don't see in film. I'm having a hard time thinking one. I'm sure there are, but it's certainly not common, and I think difficult for film to do. So it is and it's getting actually down to the simplest form of theater, which is storytelling, right? With the one-person show. And so I think one-person shows can really explore that and can be very powerful in that way. But that said, I think monologues are still used a lot these days to explore a character. Actually, Yvette Nolan, in a workshop I did with her, did a great thing. I think I had come in with a monologue, and she was like, cool, make it a scene now. And it was actually a great exercise that I've used again, because it's like, cool, because in the monologue you can get into, okay, what is the character really thinking? But then it's like, in the scene, what they're thinking becomes the background, but it's like, when does it come up? And that's where theater, I think, is really interesting. And I guess this is me in a roundabout way getting to my tip about dialogue, is being aware of what the subtext is. What is the character not saying? What are they struggling not to say? Or what are they struggling to communicate but not doing well at communicating? Helps the dialogue just happen, I think. And I don't want to be glib about that, but it knowing, and I don't think you should get caught up in this, because I think you can get caught up in what does the character want, what's their action. I don't think you should get too caught up in that, but just thinking about who they are and why are they having this conversation helps get that dialogue out there. So I guess that's my tip for dialogue. And I don't know that I have any brilliant ideas about writing monologues, because I'm not sure that any, I guess there was one play I had, well, two plays that monologues made it on stage, but those were ones that I wrote and directed myself. So no one was there to dissuade me from doing it. So I don't know that it counts.
I like that exercise of taking a monologue and turning it into a scene, because what's interesting about that transition is, of course, to have a scene, you need more than one person on stage in that respect. And then what's interesting about that is, if it's in a two-person scene, or there's two or more people in the scene, you get to have the other person present the philosophical or thematic opposite. And so they can hash out in the subtext, like a kind of argument almost between two thematic ideas, where you can, of course, you can do that in a monologue where a character is conflicted and, going back and forth on something. But I think it's a bit harder to maybe get across or to make dramatic then of course it just sort of automatically starts to become dramatic in a scene where, you know, two people are entering into a conflict, are going kind of back and forth on a subtextual level or what have you. So it's a really interesting piece of advice, and I think a really interesting exercise that, yeah, you know, it seems really worthwhile for people, you know, who are trying to elevate their work and when they're writing or editing even. Yeah, it's really interesting. The other thing I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the one act play or one person plays though. One thing I think is interesting, so where I would argue you do see one act or one person stories in film, like kind of these long extended feature length monologues, is comedy specials. I think comedy specials have weirdly become this sort of film answer to the, you know, one person play, particularly if you move into a more cinematic one like you know, Bo Burnham's Inside, or even if you're looking at something more unusually structured like Neil Brennan did one, I forget the name of the song, I think it's called Three Mics, but he had like 3 microphones on stage and he was kind of go different ones for different topics or threads, you know, thematic threads kind of running through the special. So I don't think people tend to think of those like comedy specials as feature films, but in many respects they are, and they, I think in some ways have become kind of the answer to this kind of one act or even one person, you know, multiple act plays. So but I'm just kind of curious to just maybe hear a bit more about what you think is good and not good about the one person play. Logistically, as you point out, it's something that is maybe simpler and easier to get produced for, you know, obvious reasons. But I'm curious what else you think is attractive or unattractive to you about the one person play.
What a great question. Because I do actually, I know it's interesting because we talk a lot in theater, I think, about the one person play, and some people are really just like, oh, if I see another one person play, I'm gonna lose it. But I actually went through a phase even at the Fringe where I almost didn't exclusively watch one person plays, but I was really drawn to them. So I do think there's something very compelling about it. And I think it is really getting to have a story be woven in front of you. There's something that can be so beautiful and so profound about that I think highlights the storytelling, and I think it gives theater a little bit more space, I think, to play with time and to go back in time and forward in time and have different times where you can do that with multiple actors, but it becomes logistically hard, and it's hard not to get caught up in long transitions, which is something that theaters do try to avoid. We need to make transitions interesting if we're going to have them, and if there's too many, it can get really stressful, and it can also break up a play and break up an audience's attention. But in a one person play, you can do that. Martin Dockery is very good at doing this. If we do the Fringe again, I recommend going to see his work because he is very good at doing those different threads. And I think for me, for one person play to really work well, it's to have all these threads introduced, and then you start to see how they're crossing, and at the end when it's all tied together, you go, whoa, okay, that really drove towards this point that touched on something really profound or interesting, but it made me laugh along the way, it made me feel sad along the way, and we got there. So I think that's what's really beautiful about one person shows. I think at their worst, it becomes just someone talking and can feel unrooted in something, and can feel a little bit like, hey, why do I care about what you're saying? So that's where I think they can get a little boring. And also, you know, when it's overdone, and I think also just overdone in the sense of not, oh, everyone's doing it, so I do it, but in the sense of you start to see so much that then you do become more critical. And that's actually something I find very sad about theater. And I think you get this in film and probably in reading, in all art forms, right? Is when you're younger, it's easier to be impressed and blown away. But once you're blown away, it then gets harder to get that next feeling of blown away. But I think, we're all, anyone who's really interested in art is a little bit of a junkie in that way. We're like, oh, what's the next thing that's going to blow me away? And so, yeah, once you've been blown away by some one person shows, then the next you see, you're like, well, it wasn't as good as that one.
My thing I always say is my family, who aren't writers, are always like they always give me books for like Christmas or my birthday or whatever, right? And because they think, oh, John likes books, he likes any book. And what I would always it was hard to explain to them is like, no, because I like books so much, it means I hate every book. I hate almost every book. Like I don't want any of these books. I like books less than the average person as a group, but I like individual books more than anyone else. And as you say, once you find that thing that blows you away, it's different. But it gets harder and harder, ironically, to be impressed. I think of that with horror because I love horror so much. And my daughter and my Jessie, she can't watch horror movies. She gets too scared. And I always like laugh about like, you're ironically the perfect audience for a horror movie, because I sit there and I'm like, yeah, that's scary. Like that's my reaction, right? I'm not screaming and terror running away, but that's what they want for me to do. What's kind of interesting about some of the things you said about the one act play and the kind of strengths of them, or the one person play, I should say, and the strengths of them, is that, and I think this nicely illustrates the difference between the mediums. In a screenplay or in film, to get those same effects, interestingly, and that same tone and sense, and to accomplish a lot of those same artistic ends, strangely, you have to move away from one person and into one location. It's like the kind of equivalent for the artistic effect of or how you can accomplish a lot of those artistic aims in film is by restricting the audience to one location and not jumping around in time, and having multiple characters. And that's where you get this sort of sense of closure and closeness and all these sorts of interesting and that kind of one location story has become its own little genre in and of itself, where they might take time to get to the location or they might get out of it at one point, but otherwise we're sort of trapped there. And now this drama is unfolding and it's really more about these people involved and the revelations and how things turn and twist and alter, become more sort of impressive or surprising when you have that unity, or those three unities, I guess, as the case may be in film. Whereas in the theater, it just is a different set of operations that gets you to that place. I really appreciate you talking about some of this stuff, and I'm curious, before I let you go, what sort of is the thing you like the least and like the most about the theater these days? I just have to turn my alarm off. That's my alarm to go get ready and grab my kid. So apologies for that, but I want to hear what you have to say about this first.
Do you mean theater productions or?
I would suppose whatever you like, theater productions or scripts. Yeah.
Personally, I'm a little, and this is just where I'm at right now, and I think I go through cycles of how I feel about things. Well, pandemic, I'm just sick of digital theater, and more specifically, theater that's filmed and it's a film and it's just a bad film. But that aside, I'm going to talk, I think, pre-pandemic of when I was seeing stuff. I am a bit tired of kitchen sink dramas. I think Canadian theater especially is very attracted to those. And I can't even retain them in my memory. I just don't remember them. I see them and go, oh, okay, that was all right. And it's not even that was bad. It was just, eh.
What do you mean by kitchen sink dramas? I'm not familiar with that term.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, and I'm actually kind of getting it a little bit from film and that movement in the 50s in Britain there. Um, it's dramas that are often it's in a home, often it's in a kitchen. It's called kitchen sink dramas, but it's not always. Sometimes it's in the living room or whatever. And it's one set and it's about some family
Mm,
issues
sure,
usually.
sure.
And I think those were really important at a time when, thinking the theater, the history of theater, and it used to all be about the nobility and rich people doing rich people things. And then in the 20th century we got into, well, what's real people, let's tell real stories. And so I think it's very important, and I don't want to knock it, but just personally for me right now, i I'm more interested in getting at other things and telling other stories that aren't so literal and aren't so, I guess basically what I'm saying is I'm a little off of realism, and I'm a bit more interested in where can we go creatively. I'm a fan to an extent of like the absurdist movement and anything else. And I guess this is where I like One Person Plays too, is breaking apart that mold a little bit. It's asking us to suspend our disbelief a bit. And so thinking of what I like about theater these days, I think it's just anything that uses imagination and creativity, and not in a literal sense, but is trying to get at a profound truth. And I think that's the thing that never wavers for me, is that and even with a kitchen sink drama, is trying to get at something really profound that is hard to articulate, but makes us feel it. That I love. I absolutely love, where it's like, I can't even tell you what this is making me feel, but it is making me feel something complicated, and it's helping me understand that. That's where I think theater lives and is super exciting. And so any play that can do that is awesome in my books.
Well, thanks so much for talking to me, and I think it's a great note to leave it on. And have a great day, and keep writing the wrong way.